In September, in a speech before the UN General Assembly in New York, President Putin raised hopes when he hinted that Russia might join the fight against ISIS.
We propose discussing whether it is possible to agree on a resolution aimed at coordinating the actions of all the forces that
President Obama asked for a meeting.
When they talk about Syria, and the president says, look, I don't know what you're thinking about doing there, but, we need to be coordinated, whatever might happen there. And Putin seems to suggest some, constructive language.
It seemed they may have struck an agreement.
Thank you, everybody.
Can you work together?
Can you make progress on Syria? Can you make a deal? How about a timeline, Mr. President?
And then a couple of days later, suddenly, boom, the Russians are bombing.
Russian airstrikes have killed hundreds of civilians and caused massive destruction to residential areas.
But the Russians were not bombing ISIS.
Going for the question of exactly who is Russia targeting?
What they said they were going to do was come in and fight ISIL and use their influence to move Assad aside and thereby end the civil war in Syria, which has been one of the causes of the whole fertile ground for ISIL. They didn't do either of those things.
So they lied to you.
Well, they certainly had a very different interpretation of combating ISIL.
Activists say the strikes have intensified since Russia began its air campaign to bolster the Assad regime.
The Russians have instead joined Assad against the opposition, thereby pouring gasoline on the civil war.
This is a whole new dynamic in this awful 4-year-old war at this point. Now another superpower has entered the fray with enormous military might fighting in effect on the other side, even though it says it shares the same goals that we have of fighting terrorism. And it's a huge complication for President Obama, who now has to figure out what to do.
With Assad now backed by Russian air power, the war was prolonged. Defeating ISIS delayed.
There's no question that having the war rage with all of its consequences makes defeating ISIL harder. It's also, I think, widely understood that it's hard to see how the war winds down and ends while Assad is still in office.
The simple fact is that Vladimir Putin is rubbing it in our face. We're doing nothing about it.
There was pressure on the president to somehow confront both Assad and Russia.
Clearly, our strategy is not working.
A confrontation he did not want.
But we're not going to make Syria into a proxy war between the United States and Russia. That would be bad strategy on our part. Our battle is with ISIL.
The president resisted.
The decision to engage in a military conflict with a government like Assad's that has Russian and Iranian support, or to give significant military support to groups who include al-Qaeda-backed extremists, to go down that pathway is a very momentous decision.
The death toll in Syria steadily rose throughout the fall of 2015. An already dire refugee crisis now would only grow worse. People fleeing the country exceeded 4 million. Refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey were overcrowded. The war was quickly moving beyond anyone's control.
One after the other, they keep coming, and the scale of this crisis is outstanding.
An estimated 9 million Syrians have fled the country.
This crisis that doesn't seem anywhere near over.
It is clear that by 2015, the strategic consequences of the war in Syria are becoming almost unsustainable. You have hundreds of thousands of refugees, then it spills over to Europe, where it risks undermining the basic stability of the European Union.
More nations are tightening their borders as a historic number of refugees flood into Europe.
1 million refugees into Germany alone.
Hungary says it's simply overwhelmed by the endless flow of refugees and migrants.
So, you put all of this together, and the consequences of Syria are enormous. It looks worse than the threat of ISIS.
The issue of free movement in Europe is playing out right in front of people.
The biggest mass migration of people since the Second World War.
This is the ideal situation for ISIS to penetrate Europe.
No one can look at the devastating consequences of this conflict over 5 years and not ask the question, what could we have done differently to prevent this horrific situation? And I think we've all rerun it in our minds. Could we have done this? Could we have done that? Should we do something now?
We've got to bring some sort of order to Syria so that these people don't continue to flow outward.
The events in Syria have been horrendous. The impulse to do something about it has been profound and understandable. But the president has held firm that that in and of itself is not an argument to leap into military action if you can't tell him a story about how this ends.